What I'd like to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to stand back a bit from the everyday challenges of cybersecurity. Instead, I'd like to look at the main factors that make it a constant struggle to manage cyber risk effectively. So first, a few words of introduction. I always like to set the scene on a positive note before we get into all the gloom and doom about cyber attacks that we read every day in the media. It's important to emphasize all the incredible positive impacts of digital transformation wherever we work and wherever research is improving, or in a time of pandemic is actively saving our lives. Unfortunately, though, alongside all the positives, digital technology brings a lot of challenges: political, social, economic, cultural, as well as technical. And security is one of the biggest of those challenges. All the experience of the last 30 years shows us that delivering successful cybersecurity is really, really hard. And frankly, it's not going to get any easier. Experts agree that we'll see more technological progress in the next 10 years than in the last 100 years put together. Just think of artificial intelligence, AI. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, recently told the BBC that AI is like fire or electricity or the internet, but even more profound in its effects. And he added something important: the free and open internet is under attack all around the world. And I think this reflects a critical challenge at the heart of the digital revolution. On the one hand, we're more and more dependent on digital technology. It's embedded ever deeper into every aspect of our societies. But on the other hand, that dependency is developed without us really understanding the full implications of the revolution, while hackers are doing everything they can to corrupt, control, and steal through the internet. In fact, we're in a digital arms race. The good guys are putting huge effort into digital innovation that promises fantastic benefits to the whole human race. Meanwhile, the bad guys are working at least as hard to exploit all that innovation for their own purposes. So we know we have a fight on our hands, but let's come to my exam question. Why is cybersecurity so hard? I'm going to talk about three factors that, in my view, combine to make managing cyber risk really difficult: technology, the human risk factor, and then the international context. So let's start by looking at technology. I'd suggest that there are 5 key factors which seriously complicate the job of managing security risk. Let's start with scale. Nobody knows how many digital devices there are in the world. If you just think about smartphones, Apple alone have produced 2.2 billion iPhones since their launch in 2007. And in the single year 2020, Samsung alone sold 253 million smartphones. Now that's just the smartphone market, one segment of all the digital devices which are out there. If you add on tablets, PCs, notebooks, fitness trackers, fridges, washing machines, TVs, and all the rest, we're talking about tens of billions of individual devices. And the huge number of devices is only one part of the scale challenge, because they're connected through global networks. Globalization works for the bad guys because they simply ignore international boundaries and skip between jurisdictions to conceal what they're up to. The good guys in law enforcement agencies don't have that freedom of action. They're hamstrung by the sheer global scale of the challenge. So scale is a major issue. And that scale brings complexity. As I've said, billions of devices now communicate through vast global networks with a countless number of attack surfaces, the security jargon for places where a hacker can break in. Security people like me really hate complexity. We like to keep things simple, but that's just not possible in our new digital world. Speed is the next great challenge for security people because new technologies are flooding onto the market incredibly quickly. It's just really difficult for security to keep up. An example that's on my mind at the moment is quantum computing. It's likely that within 10 or perhaps 15 years, will have quantum computers capable of performing thousands of times faster than today's most advanced devices. That should bring significant gains for cybersecurity in managing complex data. But, and there's always a but in cybersecurity, it's already clear that quantum computers will be able to crack most common encryption in the foreseeable future. That's an issue that we need to be planning for now. And certainly there's another arms race between the US and China, at least, to be first to get that capability. And there's another complication to do with all this speed of development. The people who write software and sell digital technology are running businesses, so their focus is on the rush to market and their bottom line. This need for speed can work against innovation in security. Manufacturers and vendors will often prefer to stick with trusted old solutions, even if their security is increasingly obsolete. They're simply much quicker and cheaper than designing a new solution. Impact is a big concern because in the modern digital world, there's no longer any barrier between the digital, the physical, and the biological worlds. Well, what does that mean? Think of the utility companies that provide our electricity or water. They use digital industrial control systems to control and deliver the water and the power. As we'll see later, utility companies are already high on hackers' target lists, whether they're criminals or states. Knock out electricity supply, for example, and there may be physical consequences. Imagine that the controls operating a dam are disabled. There could be a catastrophic flood, causing extensive damage to property. And there could be a direct impact on people. That's the biological component as well. In worst cases, there could be a catastrophic impact on human life, leaving people dead or seriously injured. Now, that's a really scary prospect, and I'll say a bit more about it later. And my final heading, digital innovation has led to modern business models that have radically changed how we all work. And in doing so, they've also had a significant impact on cyber security. An obvious example, even before the COVID pandemic, millions of people around the world were already working remotely, from homes, hotels, airports, train stations, cafes, you name it. Digital transformation has given us 24/7 access to our organization's data and made that business model possible. But at the same time, it's made security much more difficult to manage. To take just one simple example, a lot of people are now using insecure Wi-Fi instead of protected office networks. So 5 different technology factors make life really difficult for security. Put all 5 factors together, and you can begin to understand some of the reasons why cyber risk management is so hard in a challenging threat landscape. Now, I'm not going to say much about cyber threats in that threat landscape, but this slide gives you some idea of how complicated the threat landscape can look. Law enforcement agencies around the world are all saying the same thing. They've seen more cybercrime over the last 2 years than in the previous 5 years put together. Just one example, ransomware incidents alone have risen by more than 60% during the COVID pandemic, with increasingly bold and sophisticated attacks on targets of every size and description. Why is that? Well, think about it. If you're a criminal, you've got a great business model. You don't have to invest much. You can buy hacking tools really cheaply on the dark web, and you can even get business support thrown in that'll tell you the best way to use the tools. Add to that, you can make very serious profits. And finally, realistically, your chances of getting caught are more or less zero. The main features of the technology itself then are often working against us. What about the people who use the technology? That brings me to my second theme, the human risk factor. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this subject because my friend Nick Wilding and his other colleagues covered it in some detail in their earlier session on People Matter. And I hope he will have mentioned that Nick and I run a bi-monthly series of webinars with invited guests covering exactly this topic. You'll have heard here that managing human risk is fundamental. It's now commonly accepted that human error is a factor in about 80 to 90% of security incidents. Hackers cottoned onto this from the start, and they've become really smart at using psychology to target human weaknesses. That's been particularly obvious during the COVID pandemic. There's been a huge surge in phishing attacks that are specifically designed to trick people into doing something that helps the hackers. So obviously, the good guys also need to brush up on their psychology. They need to be much smarter about how they educate employees away from doing things that are risky, careless, or just plain stupid. So I've talked about technology and human risk, two factors that in my mind combine to make cybersecurity really difficult. I'd like to end with some comments on the international context and on politics. I mentioned earlier that hackers have very little chance of getting caught and punished for their activities. I've already mentioned one of the main reasons. Criminals don't have to worry about international frontiers and multiple jurisdictions. The internet is truly global. So that raises the obvious question. What's the international community doing to crack down on the hackers? And I have to say again, like everything to do with cybersecurity, it's complicated. One of the main complications is that a lot of the nation states are very active hackers themselves. Apart from targeting other governments, they're also going after any organization in any sector that contains potentially useful data and intellectual property. That means they're looking for just about any kind of information that they can suck out of government departments, universities, research institutions, as well, of course, as the trade secrets of companies of every size. Now, in the UK, we mainly hear about the hacking attacks carried out by a handful of state actors, the usual suspects, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. But a lot of people are surprised to learn that there are now at least 100 states running offensive cyber operations around the world. This slide will give you some idea of the targets of this state activity and the intensity of the cyber attacks on them. And some of the state cyber activity goes well beyond traditional espionage, the theft of sensitive data. As I mentioned earlier, digital industrial control systems now drive the processes of many businesses in manufacturing and the utilities. That opens the possibility for attackers to hack into a wide range of potential targets, including critical civilian infrastructure. Alongside sabotage, state hackers are also developing psychological and subversive techniques that use cyberspace to achieve their political objectives without the use of force. We've seen this in recent years in states' efforts to mess with elections in the USA and Ukraine, for example. It's complicated trying to tackle this kind of activity because of two areas of uncertainty. Of course, there will usually be an obvious suspect to blame, but it can be really difficult to know for sure where an attack is coming from in cyberspace. This is the so-called problem of attribution. A second uncertainty comes from the fact that it's often really difficult to know how a victim should react to a major cyber attack on its critical national infrastructure. Let's say that a massive cyber attack takes down the electricity network in Ruritania, a country with a long history of conflict with its regional rival Transylvania. Ruritania will immediately suspect that its old enemy Transylvania is responsible for the attack, but it can't be 100% sure, so how should it react? Should Ruritania regard that cyber attack on a critical asset as an act of war by Transylvania? Should it then take military action? If not, where should it draw the line? What's making matters worse is that the border between state cyber operations and criminal activity is increasingly blurred. It goes without saying that organized crime's always had connections with politicians and governments. It's sophisticated and it's super rich. And of course, it often suits governments to outsource cyber operations to criminals to conceal their own hand. So the deal's simple. When needed, criminal groups do the government's dirty work. In return, the government turns a blind eye to their illegal activities as long as they carry them out abroad. And of course, a share of the criminal profit goes back to the politicians and to the officials concerned. So, what's to be done? UN committees have been working quietly for 18 years on cooperative measures to address the threat of cyber attacks. Earlier this year, a UN working group recommended 11 voluntary, non-binding norms of responsible state behaviour, together with specific confidence building, capacity building, and cooperation measures. Well, all of this tells you that progress is painfully slow, but at least states are addressing some of the important basic issues. We may not yet have agreement on legal remedies, but we do have a consensus, at least in principle, on the need to protect all critical infrastructures that support essential services to the public. Apart from UN, there's also activity at a bilateral level. Some of you might, but I don't know exactly what goes on at summits between the Chinese, Russian, and US presidents. But we do know that they discuss the threats posed by state hacking. In June, when Biden and Putin met in Geneva, the US president proposed that 16 areas of US and Russian critical infrastructure, including the energy sector and water systems, should be completely off limits to attack by cyber or any other means. Biden added that the US would take action if Russia continued to allow cyber criminals to operate with impunity in Russia. That followed the Russian ransomware attack on Colonial Oil in June that took down the largest fuel pipeline in the US and led to shortages across the American East Coast. It cost $5 million in ransom to restart operations, but unusually, US law enforcement did manage to recover over $2 million from the Russian hackers. Was that the result of Biden's conversation with Putin? US officials say it's just too early to tell. They've shared information with Russian officials on the criminal ransomware activity coming out of Russia, and the Russians have committed to act against it. Is anything happening? The jury's still out. So, to recap, I've described how technology, human risk, and politics all combine to make cybersecurity really hard. In fact, I've given you a very high-level view of parts of a course that I run at the Oxford Cyber Academy. Details obviously available on request if any of you are interested. Now, I think we still have a few minutes left. David will tell me if we don't. But I'd be happy to answer any questions or comments if any are coming in.
Well, hopefully we'll have a couple come in, but I can offer you one. It seems to me that the Colonial Pipeline attack has really changed the game in terms of threats. There was an attack that found its way, the engagement of right to the White House. Would you go along with that being a bit of a game changer?
Yes, I mean, we've known, of course, for a long time that the capabilities were there, but to see it done on that scale and in that way, yes, it was a game changer, used in a criminal context rather than in a political or state context, as we've seen in Ukraine, for example. Yes, it's changed the landscape.
And to follow on from that, I mean, you talked about the various different areas of critical national infrastructure. I was speaking to someone the other day who said that I think Australia had taken their number of parts of critical national infrastructure from what you might might be 3 or 4, which would include things like energy and maybe banking, up to 11. You mentioned 16. So almost every country is now going to have these different levels, extended numbers of critical national infrastructure. Is that right?
That's right. And I think another complicating factor that people don't always think about is the fact that certainly in countries like the US and the UK, the majority of critical national structure is in private hands. So there needs to be a very high degree of collaboration, obviously, between government and companies to make sure that these systems stay secure.
Okay, that's fine. Richard, I think we're we're just about out of time. I'm glad to be able to ask you a couple of questions. Thank you for covering cyber risk management so well, and we'll look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.